in a little bit. So this is why you often meet with extreme repression when you start a resistance movement. It's because the people in power know that their power depends on a kind of mystique of invincibility, and it depends on another very important quality, which we owe the identification of this to Kenneth Boulding, and that is legitimacy. As long as the regime is perceived as legitimate, it can do anything. If you can get that switched off, it can't do anything. So how to do that is a big mystery, but one part of that mystery is very clear, and that is that violent resistance is not very effective at proving that the regime is illegitimate. It is.
So what I'm wondering is that I don't think this government is, I mean,
You're talking about our government here?
Our government is not legitimate because of the election 2001
Yeah.
and 2004. In both cases, there's evidence that things
Yeah.
are not legitimate, but it seems like people do not really want to do that.
Yeah.
They don't care.
You're bringing up a very important point, and it's the point that Gandhi was emphasizing when he talked about that line between the head and the heart. People, this is a funny thing about human beings, of course everyone in this class is an exception, okay? But your general run of humanity, they will only believe what they want to believe, what's convenient for them to believe. So nonviolence is not really about getting them to believe something so much as it is about getting them to want to believe something. You make it somehow, and there's two ways of going about that. You want to show them that what they are clinging to is ugly, illegitimate, whatever you want to call it, and they'll be happier somewhere else. You have to do both. Remember the famous quotation from Toynbee about the British in India, about Gandhi. He made it impossible for us to go on ruling India, but he made it possible for us to leave without rancor and without humiliation. So the nonviolent actor really has to do both. Violent actor doesn't. Life is very easy for those people in some stupid, unsatisfying way. But yes, we've now reached a point, and this line changes. So you can change the degree to which people will disbelieve the truth by propaganda. Propaganda, incidentally, was invented by the British in the First World War. And now, we're getting a little bit far afield, but this is so fascinating, can't resist. Now, you see, the problem is that the forces of reaction in this culture have a ready-made automatic propaganda machine worth $50 billion a year. They don't have to spend a dime. It works 24/7. They don't have to even pick up a finger. It's called advertising. And we can discuss this later on in the semester, but I don't want you to leave this course without being able to see point for point how some innocuous ad that's selling you something is actually selling you the whole paradigm, which involves neoconservatism and violence and all the rest of it. Yeah?
Don't you think it also, there also be powerlessness?
Yes. Yes. That's a key part, and that's what, advertising depends on your believing that you're powerless and you have to buy their product to get what you want. I happen to know of two absolutely excellent marketing people, and they have never come up with a campaign that said, the infinite spirit is within you, you're already happy, just discover it, you don't need our product. You can see how ridiculous it would be to tell the truth in that context. So it's true that all of that is going on, and that's why I said how this perception of legitimacy is mysterious. We don't know what does it. I think the only thing we can say with some security about it is that nonviolence is very powerful at gaining legitimacy for an uprising, which in turn means draining legitimacy from a regime, and that's how paradoxical repression episodes happen, and violence is very bad at this. That's about all we can say. But still, it is a fascinating thing to consider. I think there's a lot of things about nonviolence that are like this, that you cannot predict exactly when or in what form your thing is going to work. And that's where the faith element comes in. You have faith that you're doing it right. That's all you're responsible for. It kind of reminds me, I'm not sure why, of this anecdote about some person going to his spiritual director and saying, you're always saying that we should work, and yet you're telling us that everything depends on God. It doesn't make sense. If everything depends on God, we should pray, not work. And if nothing depends on God, we should work, not pray. And he said, okay, work as though everything depended on you, and pray as though everything depended on God. That was his formula for that. Okay, so it's not relevant, but I just thought we kind of need to mention it at this point. It's similar, though, to what I'm saying, which is that we have a certain capacity, which may seem to us to be limited, but it's actually crucial, to commit ourselves to the means. Then we let the ends more or less take care of themselves. That's how a nonviolent actor goes about addressing changing something. Whereas what the violent actor says is, I've got to change that no matter what, and it's got to look exactly like this, and it has to happen now. So what I'm saying is we can work on that marvelous paradigm shift where people begin to perceive that not only that this particular government is not legitimate, but that the whole style of governing is not legitimate, and the way of carrying on international affairs is not legitimate. We've just got to work for that, and assume that if we do our work well, it will happen. If not in my lifetime, at least in yours. And I'm okay with that. Okay, so let's go on with this. As I've mentioned, you had an array of movements that come out of this. Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras, and it gives you kind of a good laboratory because the Nicaraguan experiment was basically departed from the nonviolent path pretty early. The Costa Rican one, for some funny reason, went on to become even more nonviolent until you have Costa Rica today is one of the very few countries in the world that has no army, and Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere right now, and that's partly because of the 1979 revolution made them look like something that Ronald Reagan wanted to crush. So I'm not saying it's entirely their fault, but I am saying that it is not a coincidence that the Nicaraguan model led to such a bad conclusion and the Costa Rican model led to such a good one. Anyway, two of these four uprisings were very successful, and they spread very quickly, and Patricia Parkman gives you some good examples of how the word got out and spread around. Women of Honduras imitate the women of Cuscatlan, who in the struggle has been the most heroic and self-denying. So two interesting things here. To what extent is this a movement that comes from particular groups? And she struggles with this issue throughout the description in her whole book. In other words, the form that the uprising takes is that of a strike. Our immediate association with strike, because of our Marxist background, is a class struggle. But this is not exactly a class struggle. This is a struggle of the people as a whole against the government as a whole. In a larger sense, of course, in Central America, South America, you could say that it is a class struggle because there's a union of the rich and the powerful on top, and you have the poor people living in favelas and so forth on the bottom. But it is a different kind of struggle. And so in a way, what matters is that people can be self-denying to bring a certain kind of power into this struggle. And the real contrast is between the mentality of the dictator, who is absolutely the most self-affirming kind of person. You know, he says, I'm the decider, and things like that. You're my base, I'm the top of the pyramid. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, of course. But it's the exact opposite of self-denial. So this is a recrudescence, a springing back up into life of an ideology of self-denial. And this is in one way a universal human struggle that goes on and on and on throughout history, grouping itself into one form and now into another. So in that sense, it pretty much doesn't matter what class of society you come from. But when the thing gets rolling, it does matter that indeed women are brought into the struggle. That seems to be one of the really key elements. And the thing is, it almost always starts with students. So I say we get rid of students who wouldn't have any of these problems. But it's, you remember if you were in last semester, critical period in the South African struggle was early in 1913 when women and laborers were brought in. And when that happened, the Satyagraha became invincible. So it partly does matter and partly doesn't. And my famous slogan, if you will, it's a little bit too long for a t-shirt, but we'll figure out something, is it is not so much about what kind of people we have in power, but what kind of power we have in people. You can see both of those things playing themselves out here. The students of Nicaragua are with the democratic students of Central America. This is on the next page. We shall sustain democracy in Central America, cost what it may. Okay, why did I emphasize those last 4 words? Let's just talk about that a little bit. Yeah, I'm sorry. You could link it up with karma yoga. That would be interesting. I was thinking of something a little more obvious than that. I think you're too smart for this kind of question. Sid? Yes. So they felt that they were at stage 3 of the escalation curve, and whether they were or not, it gave them a great deal of power to be able to say that. I mean, once you say this thing has got to be overcome no matter what, they can't really stop you anymore because they'll threaten you with stuff and you've already given it up. You know, it's like Gandhi pointing out in connection with civil disobedience that the law doesn't really say you cannot X, Y, or Z. The law says if you do X, Y, or Z, we will take away X prime, Y prime, and Z prime. So if you've already given those 3 up, the law is powerless in that instance, in particular say. So that shows you that we've identified 2 very important things about the spirit of this, that it was being galvanized by a sense of self-denial. And if you remember Gandhi's famous expression that his marches and stuff and the whole struggle in general was a yajna, or sacrifice. And really, the opposition is claiming that it is undergoing sacrifice also. It's kind of a duplicitous game that they're playing. Okay, so they know that this is extreme. They are involving different elements of society, and they are appealing to the desire to sacrifice self, which actually turns out to be, though you'd never get that impression from our culture, it turns out to be a very deep motivation for people. Once you've touched that, you can really go almost anywhere. Just one couple of sentences earlier than that, I want to point out that on June 23rd in Guatemala, students, teachers, and lawyers in Guatemala City initiated another massive shutdown, consciously modeled on that of El Salvador. And again, in 1 week, July 1st, the president of Guatemala, Jorge Ubico, resigned. So I'm interested here keenly in the consciously modeled part, because the single most detrimental factor in peace development worldwide has been the lack of a learning process. So that every time you start a movement, you have to reinvent the wheel and start it all over again. And this is perhaps the most hopeful development in nonviolence over the last 20, 25 years. But of course, as you can see, it started earlier in terms of local regions. But now, globalism could mean the globalization of nonviolence. So that, why not? So that people in one corner of the world would learn from what their brothers and sisters in another corner of the world did, and they could start at square 3 instead of square 1. And they could reach a tipping point, and we could actually live in England's green and pleasant land here. We built Jerusalem, or whatever it was that Blake said. So I did want to touch on one other thing, so let me just quickly point out it's useful to bear these technical terms in mind, because then we can prove to our parents and other citizens of California that we've not wasted their tuition money. So do remember the concept of brazos caídos, arms dropped. But again, there's an important principle behind it, and that's this, that again, we're talking about is not people creating an alternative. They haven't said anything about loving their opponents. What they're talking about is withdrawal of cooperation, of consent. So we're talking about the most, I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, it's not working, the most primitive form of nonviolence. Which is to say, I will not go along with your XYZ, whatever it is, your killing thing, you can't get my compliance with this. That's the bare beginning of nonviolence. We're going to look at episodes and movements where it was carried much further than that. Okay, do you have anything else that you would like to emphasize, highlight, or question in this little description? I think it's kind of a good exercise in how to get information out of these things. If not, I'll spend the concluding few minutes on a rather poignant case of nonviolence. Okay? Okay, on we go. For a finale today, I would like to share with you a resource and a movement. The resource is a book that you have in your list of resources right after the syllabus in the reader. It's a kind of encyclopedia called Protest, Power, and Change, an encyclopedia of nonviolent action from ACT UP to women's suffrage. And I was afraid of this. Hang on just a second. The movement that I wanted to share with you, okay, here we go, took place in January of 1948, so we're still talking about this World War II era and non-war things that are going on in the world. And here's my surprise for today. This is the cookie for today. It took place in Iraq. Just imagine. So let's talk about what happened briefly and talk about what the repercussions of what that means for us here today. This is called correctly by these authors a predominantly nonviolent movement. So again, let's remember that this is very weak because it's in violation of Nagler's law. I'm sure Nagler's law is the 11th commandment. You cannot violate it without losing lots of power. But you really cannot expect to see nonviolence doing its stuff if you mix it up with a little bit of violence just to make sure. So somehow everything goes over to the violence when you do that. But this was okay, a predominantly nonviolent movement. The situation was that there was a treaty in Iraq. The British, who basically created Iraq, made a treaty with that country that, guess what, gave them control over oil reserves. Surprise, surprise. And they also put in a nice puppet ruler to make sure that everything would go along smoothly. 1948 came time to the renewal of the treaty, and by this time they hated Salih Jabr, who was the head of the country, who had been put in there by the British, and people decided they wouldn't have it. And while he was in England ratifying the treaty, the streets of Baghdad were in utter turmoil, but a very different kind of turmoil from the streets of Baghdad today, you'd hardly say. It's demonstrations and strikes, and it's going to lead to the resignation of the Prime Minister, Salih Jabr, and to the repudiation of the treaty, so that from 1948 until the next round of colonialism in 1990, the Iraqis actually had control to some degree over their own oil reserves. There were other issues. There were food shortages, and basically Jabr was very unpopular by that time. And I think this is actually kind of unfortunate because I think nonviolence works best when it focuses on one issue, and it's an issue of principle, and they stick to that issue, and you even carry out what's called, what is it called? Anyone remember from last semester? No fresh issue. Thank you, Amy. So you stick to that until it's secured, and then you go on to something else. So the fact that they hated the guy is actually not a plus for us. It means that it was easier to overthrow him, but it means that the overthrow was not quite as much a victory for nonviolence as it was just a victory of the Iraqi people. He comes back to Baghdad, and the demonstrations are so severe that he couldn't even land in the Iraqi airport. He had to land in a British military airport and travel up to Baghdad in disguise. Disfrazada. And on January 26th, he ordered the police to use machine guns to disperse the protest demonstration. Okay, let's do a little role play here. Imagine that you're average Joe reporter, and you've never taken PAX 164, you've never heard of it, or you're living there in outer darkness in North Gate Hall here, learning to be a journalism student, and you want to finish the story. So Jabr uses machine guns to dispel the demonstrators. What would you say? He has more power than the people, right? So what's going to be the outcome? The people leave. Yeah, they were dispersed. They saw those machine guns and they said, however you say this in Arabic, I'm getting the hell out of here. But now let's suppose that you have taken PAX 164 and you have a clue, and you're writing real news. Tell me what you think would happen. And you can even tell me what it's called and where to find it on my website, Catherine. Paradox of Repression, which predicts that what will happen.
That, like you said, like, once the experiment was in trial.
Well, you know, that's also a very good point, that once the police have been required to use live ammunition and kill people, they start losing their nerve. And there's even a case not in Iraq but in Iran, where it was very, very, very violent in the 79 revolution, where one soldier was ordered to fire on the crowds, and he refused, and they started giving him a hard time. He shot his commanding officer, and then shot himself. Yeah, it can be that extreme. But what do you think would happen to the movement when this act of extreme violence is exerted against it? Zoe? Yes. Okay, I guess what we're coming down to here is there's one of two possibilities. We're either going to have a Sharpeville episode where, oh, that's right, you weren't in PAX 64A. When you use nonviolence against an unarmed demonstration, the people lose their nerve and they resort to violence. But there's another possibility. What if they don't lose their nerve? What's going to happen? Well, let me just read you the sentence. Jabr ordered police to use machine guns to disperse protest demonstrations. In response to this threat, thousands of Iraqis poured into the streets in protest. Exactly what we saw with Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's red shirt movement. I said movie because it is now a movie, from movement to movie, in the Northwest Frontier province. Okay, what I am not saying is every time you use violence, there will be a paradox of repression. I mean, you use violence as an oppressor. It doesn't always happen. Again, it's one of these things where it's a principle, but you cannot always predict exactly what the outcome will be. But this was a very plausible outcome given nonviolent logic, and it's a completely impossible outcome given standard journalism school logic. Over the weekend, you want something to think about while you're reading all of this stuff on the other insurrectionary movements. Just think, what if we knew about this in 1990? Just think, what could be going on today in Iraq? I think it'd be fun to spend a few minutes just visualizing what could have happened, what we could be living through now. Okay, folks, have a great weekend. I'll see you.